Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to take this really dense stack of historical analysis and economic data and trace a journey that's, well, it's pretty incredible.
It really is. We're looking at a story that unfolds over 4 centuries and is just packed with, well, with irony.
Exactly. We're traveling back to the 1600s, and you have to picture the scene. The entire global economy, or at least a huge chunk of it, is basically one massive high-stakes race.
A race to India. All eyes were on the riches coming out of the subcontinent. We're talking spices, silks, the finest textiles in the world. This was the source of immense wealth.
And if you think about this race, you have the usual suspects, right? The big players. Our sources are all very clear on who they were.
Oh, yeah. The heavy hitters. You've got the British, the French, the Dutch, who were incredibly powerful at the time, and of course the Portuguese, who had been there for a while.
These were the empires with the deep pockets, the huge naval fleets. They were the ones you'd expect to dominate.
And they did.
Yeah.
But today, we're focusing on a different player.
We are. We're shining a light on the quintessential underdog. The small team, a smaller European nation, that looked at this incredibly fierce, cutthroat competition and said,
We want it in.
we want a piece of that action too. We are diving deep into the history of the Danish presence in India.
And what's so fascinating, and what the data shows so clearly, is that as a business venture, it was a complete and utter failure, an absolute financial flop.
But, and this is the core of our deep dive today, that failure somehow, accidentally, gave rise to one of India's most important and really enduring cultural and educational centers.
It's this incredible paradox. The sources lay out this story in 4 distinct phases, and that's how we're going to tackle it.
So the mission for us is to unpack how a venture that was created for one reason, and one reason only, pure aggressive profit, how it transitioned through its own collapse into a mission focused purely on knowledge and culture.
It's a remarkable case study, isn't it? It shows how these huge external forces, geopolitics, rivalries, even just fear, can completely derail what you intend to do and then create something totally unintended and arguably far more valuable in the long run.
So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Okay, so phase 1, this is the Danish attempt to even get into the race. It all starts in 1616.
Right, with a classic burst of what you'd call mercantilist ambition. The king of Denmark at the time, Christian IV, he's looking across the water at London, at Amsterdam.
And he's seeing all this wealth just flooding in.
Exactly. And he wants a piece of it for Copenhagen. He thinks, well, if the British can have an East India Company and the Dutch have theirs, then Denmark needs one too.
So the Danish East India Company is officially chartered, and our sources are really emphatic about this point. Its goal was singular.
100%. It was about making money, period.
Yeah.
This was not some grand colonial project about planting the Danish flag for glory or engaging in cultural exchange.
No, this was a commercial vehicle. Pure and simple, designed to get rich from the India trade and funnel that wealth back to the Danish crown and its investors.
And, you know, we have to give them some credit. While Denmark was a smaller player than Britain or France, this was a huge national undertaking for them.
Oh, absolutely. These ventures were incredibly expensive, weren't they? And so risky.
Massively risky. You're commissioning ships for a journey that takes months. You have to hire experienced crews. You have to buy goods to trade with, and you have to fund a military force to protect your investment on the other side of the world. For a smaller state, that's a gigantic capital outlay.
So they get the company off the ground, and now they need a base of operations in India, a foothold, and they actually move pretty fast.
They do. Just 4 years after the company's formed, in 1620, they secure their first crucial base.
And that was Tranquebar.
Tranquebar, right. On the Coromandel coast in South India, in what's now Tamil Nadu. And this was a really important first step.
How did they manage to secure it? Did they conquer it?
No, that's a key detail. They negotiated, they got permission from the local Indian ruler, the Nayak of Thanjavur, to build a small Fort Dansborg and set up a trading post.
So this establishes their first base. It proves the concept in a way.
Exactly. It proved they could do it. They could navigate the really complex politics of securing land rights in India. They could build a defensible base, and they could manage these incredibly long and difficult supply lines back to Europe.
But the sources seem to suggest that while Tranquebar was, a success in getting their foot in the door, it wasn't the strategic jackpot they needed.
It wasn't. It was limited. The Coromandel Coast was famous for its textiles, especially fine muslins and calicos, and those were very profitable. But It just didn't have the sheer scale or the diversity of wealth that was being generated further north.
And they stayed there for a long time.
A very long time.
Yeah.
For over 130 years, Tranquebar was pretty much their only major established outpost. They were running a decent but a very localized small-scale operation.
So the ambition was there from the start, but it sounds like maybe the capital just wasn't there to expand beyond that first foothold for, well, for over a century.
I think that's exactly right. And this is the constant tension in the Danish story. The ambition of a major power, but the resources of a minor one. If they were ever going to seriously compete with the big guys, they had to move north.
They had to get to Bengal.
They had to get to Bengal. As the 18th century rolled on, it became painfully obvious to everyone in the trade, including the Danish leadership, that if you weren't in Bengal, you were early in the game.
Which brings us to their second major move in 1755, a staggering 135 years after they established Tranquebar.
An incredible gap, isn't it?
It is. So in 1755, they established a new base, Frederick Nagore, which everyone started calling Serampore. And it's right in the heart of Bengal. This feels like the big, aggressive, strategic play.
It was meant to be. And the location, I mean, we really can't overstate how important the location of Serampore was. If Tranquebar was like opening a regional branch office.
Bengal was the global headquarters.
Absolutely. It was the global headquarters of wealth generation in Asia. Our sources detail exactly why. Bengal was, without any real dispute, the richest, most commercially vital province in the entire Indian subcontinent.
And it wasn't just about one product like textiles. It was the sheer volume and variety, right?
Completely. You had the river networks of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, which gave you unparalleled access deep into the inland markets. You had massive textile manufacturing, yes, especially those superfine muslins Europe was crazy for.
But also other things, strategic goods.
Critically important strategic goods. Bengal was a huge producer of saltpeter.
Which is a key ingredient for gunpowder.
The key ingredient. So in an era of constant European warfare, controlling saltpeter supplies was a massive strategic advantage. On top of that, you had silk, sugar, opium. Being in Bengal meant you were sitting right on top of the world's most lucrative supply chains.
So in 1755, the Danes finally make the right strategic move. They go to where the money is.
They make the right call, yes. It shows they understood the economic map of the world. But here's the problem. Here's the fatal flaw in the plan.
The timing.
The timing was just terrible. They're making this aggressive move to get into the heart of Bengal in 1755. But by that point, they weren't just stepping into a crowded market.
They were stepping into the shadow of a giant.
A giant that was actively consolidating its power. By the mid-1750s, the British East India Company was already transitioning from just a trading company into this quasi-sovereign military power that was beginning to dominate the entire region.
Before we move into that inevitable failure, I want to go back to that 130-year gap. It's just so long. Do the sources give us any more insight into why it took so long? Was it really just money?
It's a great question, and it really highlights their core weakness. It wasn't a lack of desire, it was a fundamental lack of capacity. For a nation like Denmark, you have to think about what it takes to launch a second major colonial venture.
You have to recover the costs of the first one for a start.
Right. You have to prove that Tranquebar is even profitable, which took time. And then you have all the internal European politics. Denmark was involved in numerous conflicts, especially with Sweden, which constantly drained the national treasury. The 17th and early 18th centuries were just brutal for Europe's smaller powers.
So when they finally scraped together the capital and the political will to establish Serampore in 1755, it was during a rare moment of, what, stability and solvency back home?
Precisely. It represented a huge national effort. But they launched that effort right at the moment their chief competitor was achieving military and political dominance after key battles like Plassey just a couple of years later.
So right strategy, right location, but a decade or two too late.
More than that, they were trying to set up shop in a neighborhood that was already being taken over by the most aggressive, powerful developer the world had ever seen. And that leads us directly into phase 2.
The inevitable business failure.
The inevitable and really the spectacular collapse.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of this failure. They're in the right place, Serampore, but the plan to get rich just never works out. The money evaporates.
And the reason isn't some complex economic theory. It's actually brutally simple. It comes down to scale and power. The sources use this analogy of a small local shop trying to compete with giant supermarkets.
Let's flesh that out. Just how big was the British East India Company at this point compared to the Danish operation?
The difference is almost absurd. By the late 18th century, the British EIC wasn't really a company in the way we think of it. It was a shadow state,
It had its own army.
a massive private army numbering in the hundreds of thousands of locally recruited soldiers, the sepoys, all led by British officers. It wasn't just defending warehouses, it was conquering territory.
And it was collecting taxes, right?
Yes, that's a critical point. It controlled the tax revenue from vast regions like Bengal and Madras. That revenue alone was more than the entire national budgets of some European countries. They had their own navy that worked alongside the Royal Navy. They were a military and political superpower.
And the Danes in Serampore, what did they have?
A small garrison, a handful of trading ships, which were often old, a customs house. They had no political leverage, no military muscle to protect their own trade routes, and crucially, no financial reserves to survive a bad season or an economic downturn.
So they were completely dependent on the British, essentially.
On the goodwill of the British for almost everything. And if your entire business model relies on the kindness of your biggest and most ruthless competitor, well, you don't really have a business model.
You have a systemic vulnerability. And this is where the story gets really fascinating, because events happening thousands of miles away in Europe start to directly sabotage the Danish operation in India.
This is the geopolitical domino effect. It's devastating. Being far from Europe didn't protect them, it just made them an easier target. Anytime Britain and Denmark found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict back home.
Which happened a lot during the Napoleonic Wars, for instance.
It happened several times, and the moment war was declared in Europe, the consequences in India were immediate and absolute for the Danes.
So what would happen? The British forces in Calcutta would just march across the river.
Pretty much. They wouldn't even need to wait for formal orders from London. The local British commanders, being the dominant military power, would see Serampore as enemy territory. They'd send a contingent of troops, they'd walk into Frederick-Nagore, seize the government buildings, lock the warehouses.
Hoist the Union Jack.
And that was that. The sources are explicit. The Danish settlements were occupied twice by the English during these periods of conflict.
Just imagine trying to run a business under those conditions. You're a merchant, you've got a warehouse full of textiles ready to ship, and suddenly, because of some dynastic squabble in the Baltic Sea, your main competitor comes in, seizes all your assets, and shuts your business down for months or even years.
It's impossible. There's no continuity. No investor is going to put money into a company that could be shut down at a moment's notice by its rival. It just completely destroyed any chance they had of long-term profitability.
They could not compete with an opponent who could literally just turn their lights off whenever they wanted to.
Without any consequence whatsoever.
So the end result of all this systemic disruption was inevitable.
Bankruptcy. By 1777, the Danish East India Company was done. Commercially finished, it had failed completely. The profit motive that drove them to India in the first place was officially dead.
Okay, so the company goes bankrupt, the investors lose everything. This seems like the logical moment for the British to just say, okay, it's ours now, and absorb Serampore completely. It was right there across the river from Calcutta, their capital. Why didn't that happen?
And that question is the critical pivot point from Phase 2 into Phase 3. What happened next wasn't a business decision. It was an act of, well, of national pride by the Danish crown.
Government stepped in.
The Danish government itself stepped in. To stop the colonies from being completely swallowed up by Britain, which would have been a national humiliation, the Danish crown took direct, official control of Serampore and Tranquebar.
So it goes from being the private asset of a failed company to being an official state-owned colony of Denmark.
Exactly. It's a symbolic move to maintain Danish sovereignty over the territory, even though, commercially, it was now a massive liability. It was costing the state money to maintain.
So they've saved the colony, but they've lost the reason for having the colony in the first place. The whole point was profit, and now it's just a drain on the treasury.
Right. And now Denmark is left holding this small, expensive, geopolitically vulnerable piece of land right in the heart of British India. It needs a new purpose. And that's what sets the stage for the most dramatic and unexpected transformation in the entire story.
This is the core aha moment of this whole deep dive. The business is dead. Serampore is a liability being kept alive by national pride. And yet, this very failure, this status as a neutral, weak, minor European power, is what gives it completely new and a much more powerful function.
The pivot is just extraordinary. With profit off the table, Serampore suddenly becomes incredibly useful as a safe haven. But not just any safe haven, a very specific one.
A safe haven for Christian missionaries.
Precisely. And the whole key to understanding Serampur's lasting importance is to understand why these missionaries so desperately needed a safe place to operate right next to the biggest British city in India.
Let's paint that picture. It's around the year 1800. Why were the British, a Christian nation, so actively hostile to Christian missionaries in their own territory?
It came down to the core business interests of the British East India Company. The EIC was still the de facto government, and its primary goals were simple: maintain stability, keep trade flowing, and collect land taxes. That was it.
And to do that, they had an official policy of not meddling in local religion and customs.
A very strict policy of non-interference. And the motivation was not tolerance or multiculturalism. It was pure, pragmatic fear.
Fear of what?
Fear of rebellion. The EIC leadership was terrified that aggressive missionary activity, public preaching, converting people, criticizing Hindu or Muslim practices would upset the delicate social balance.
They worried it would alienate the local population.
Alienate them, and potentially spark massive uprisings. You have to remember, they were a tiny number of Europeans governing millions of Indians. A large-scale rebellion would be a catastrophe for business. It would disrupt tax collection, halt trade, and cost a fortune in military suppression.
So from the EIC's perspective, a missionary wasn't a soul saver. He was a corporate risk, a liability that threatened the bottom line.
Exactly. A missionary was a match in a powder keg. So the British either severely restricted or outright banned missionary work in the huge territories they controlled, especially in Bengal. They wanted quiet, profitable compliance, not religious upheaval.
So the British, in their quest for stability, created a vacuum. They created the need for neutral space right on their own doorstep.
And Serampore was perfectly positioned to fill that vacuum because it was controlled by the Danes, who were totally neutral in this fight and frankly had nothing to lose commercially. It became the ideal sanctuary.
So missionaries, many of them British, who couldn't legally operate in British Calcutta,
Could just take a boat across the Hooghly River and set up shop in Serampore under the protection of the Danish flag.
so the very weakness and commercial failure of the Danes became Serampore's greatest strategic asset.
It's an incredible irony, isn't it? And this is where the famous Serampore mission comes into the story. A group of missionaries, most famously a trio of brilliant men, William Carey, Joshua Marshman, and William Ward.
And these weren't just preachers. They were linguists, educators, innovators.
They were pioneers. They came to Serampore specifically because it was the only place in the region that would have them. They couldn't work anywhere else.
Let's talk about William Carey. He's often called the father of modern missions. He came from a humble background, a shoemaker, but he was a linguistic genius.
He was obsessed with language. Carey understood something fundamental, that if you want to communicate complex ideas, whether religious or otherwise, you have to do it in the local language. And you need the tools to spread those ideas widely.
And his primary tool for that was the Serampore Mission Press. Our sources really stress that this wasn't just a printing press, this was a game changer.
A technological marvel for its time and place. It was one of India's first modern high-volume printing presses, and the challenge they faced was immense.
They couldn't just use a standard European printing set, could they?
No. To print in languages like Bengali or Sanskrit or Marathi, you need complex scripts with hundreds of unique characters. They had to design, carve, and cast thousands of individual metal pieces of type for each language. This was cutting-edge work, a huge investment of time and money, all happening under Danish protection.
And the output from this press was just staggering. We know the main goal was the Bible, but what was the scale of that work?
It's monumental. By the 1830s, the Serampore Press had translated and printed at least some portion of the Bible in around 40 different Indian languages and dialects. 40. But here's where their legacy expands way beyond just religion.
Right. To translate, you need translators. To have readers, you need people who are literate.
Precisely. They quickly realized they had to build an entire educational ecosystem. So the press started churning out essential secular materials.
Like what?
Dictionaries, grammar books. These were some of the first systematic attempts to codify and standardize these languages for print. And, critically, they started printing newspapers and magazines in vernacular languages.
Publications like Samikar Darpan.
Exactly, which was effectively the birth of modern Bengali journalism and prose. They were creating the tools for a new kind of public discourse.
So by creating these standardized dictionaries and grammar guides, they weren't just helping themselves, they were helping to define the modern literary forms of these languages for everyone.
That's the key. The power of print is standardization. Before this, dialects could vary wildly from town to town. The Serampore Press helped create a common literary standard that could be shared, taught, and used for education and politics across the entire region.
And all of this work, this cultural and linguistic engine, eventually culminates in their most lasting creation.
The founding of Serampore College in 1818.
This wasn't just a seminary for training priests, was it?
No, its vision was much broader. It was founded as a true center for higher learning, and its approach was revolutionary at the time. It was open to students of all castes, all religions, all backgrounds.
And the curriculum reflected that. It wasn't just Western education being imposed.
Not at all. It was designed as a bridge. They taught Western science and philosophy alongside classical Indian literature and philosophy. The goal was to train a new generation of local leaders, teachers, and thinkers.
And the most incredible detail, the thing that really shows the lasting impact of all this,
Is that Serampore College is still there today. It's a major, fully functioning, accredited university. It holds this unique, honored place in the history of higher education in India.
So let's just hammer home this paradox one more time. Serampore, the business venture, was a total failure. The Danish crown was stuck with a financial lemon.
A complete write-off.
But because it failed, and because the hugely powerful British East India Company was so paranoid about internal rebellion, Serampore became this protected bubble, a powerhouse of printing technology, linguistic innovation, and modern education. It achieved a level of historical importance its founders could never have dreamed of in a field they never intended to enter.
It's the ultimate story of unintended consequences. The British wanted stability above all else, so they banned missionaries. That ban created the loophole, the tiny Danish colony, which then became the safe house for the very people who would drive a massive intellectual and cultural transformation right under their noses. A huge, lasting legacy born entirely from colonial anxiety.
Which brings us to the final phase, Phase 4, the end of the road. By the 1840s, the unique conditions that made Serampore so special were starting to disappear.
Right. The geopolitical landscape of India had changed completely. The game was over.
What was the big shift?
The final consolidation of British power. By the 1840s, after a series of wars and treaties, Britain was the absolute, uncontested supreme power across the entire subcontinent. The era of little European pockets, these tiny independent territories, was effectively finished.
So for the Danish government back in Copenhagen, Serampore must have looked like an anachronism, a historical leftover.
And an expensive one. The original reason for being there, trade, was long dead. The unique strategic value it had as a safe haven was also diminishing. So why keep paying the bills for the administration, the police, the upkeep?
The cost-benefit analysis just didn't make sense anymore.
It was all cost and no benefit. The Crown decided it was time to cut its losses and close this chapter of its history.
And at the same time, the British attitude towards missionaries had also changed, hadn't it? The source material says the deep-seated fear the EIC had was gone.
It had softened considerably. This was a major shift. A few things happened. The EIC's trade monopoly was broken in 1813, which opened India to more direct influence from Britain. And back in London, the evangelical movement had become a powerful political force in Parliament.
And they lobbied for missionary rights.
They did, successfully. They pushed for laws that gave missionaries the legal right to operate in British India. So the old corporate fear that missionaries would instantly cause financial ruin was replaced by more cautious acceptance under much closer government control.
So the very reason for Serampore's special status as a safe haven had basically evaporated.
It was gone. The British were now so secure in their power and so pressured by politics back home that they were perfectly happy to absorb the territory. And ironically, it was a territory that had been turned into a cultural and educational jewel by the very people they used to ban.
They were ready to finally color in that little blank spot on their map of India.
And the end, thankfully, wasn't violent. There was no military seizure this time. It was a transaction.
The peaceful conclusion. In 1845, Denmark officially ceded, or rather sold, Serampore and its other territories, like Trunkabar, to Britain.
That was it. The deal was done. It formally ended Denmark's colonial presence in Bengal after about 150 years.
And was it a big sale? Did they get a lot of money for it?
Not really. It was more of a token sum. It underscored that they weren't selling a profitable business. They were just transferring the land and the buildings. It was a neat way to close the books, let the Danish crown save face, and get rid of an ongoing expense.
A fascinating end. The business failed in 1777, but the colony itself survived for nearly 70 more years, purely on the strength of the cultural mission that grew up in the vacuum of that failure.
It really is a clean four-part story. Born from commercial ambition, killed by overwhelming competition, reborn through geopolitical necessity, and then finally peacefully absorbed once that necessity expired. A perfect case study in unintended consequences.
Okay, let's wrap this up. So what does this all mean when you put it all together for you, the listener?
Well, we started with phase one. The Danes arrive with one goal: commerce, making money. They plant their flags in Tranquebar, and then much later in the strategically vital Serampore.
Then we saw phase two, the predictable, inevitable commercial failure. They were just too small, too underfunded, and too vulnerable to the massive British military and economic machine, which leads to the company's bankruptcy.
And then the game changer, phase three. The colony gets this second, much more important life as a neutral, safe space, and this sanctuary becomes absolutely critical for the groundbreaking work in printing, linguistics, and education done by the Serampore mission, giving us Serampore College.
A cultural legacy born from a geopolitical loophole. And finally, phase four brings the story to a tidy end. The Danes sell the territory to the British in 1845 once its unique purpose is gone, leaving behind this incredible, enduring cultural institution that outlived the empire that created it.
You know, when we talk about the history of empire, we usually focus on the big stories, the intentional conquests, the grand plans made in London or Paris. But the story of Serampore forces us to think about something else: the hidden power of unintended consequences.
Right. The source material here is so clear. This great cultural legacy, standardized languages, a university, a printing revolution. It wasn't born from some grand Danish strategic plan. Their plan was just to make money from textiles.
It was born almost entirely out of the pragmatic and very specific fear of rebellion held by the British East India Company.
Just think about that for a second. The very thing that the world's most powerful corporation was most afraid of, religious instability, is the exact thing that created the conditions for one of the region's great centers of learning to flourish right on its doorstep.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other major historical milestones or foundational cultural institutions came about not from the grand designs of empires, but from their blind spots, their failures, or their anxieties? It suggests that sometimes the most lasting legacies aren't built by the biggest players with the biggest plans. Sometimes they're forged by the smaller players, operating in the shadows cast by the giants.
That is a powerful thought to mull over. That was the deep dive into the fascinating, failed, and ultimately successful story of the Danish in India. Thank you for diving deep with us.